it's very, very English, and it's rooted in English struggles and English landscape and things like that. So I guess it's not essential, but it does make it very, very interesting when you understand all the nuances.
It was a time of real change when Britain was trying to face the future, but not quite certain whether it wanted to leave the past. And the film presents that dilemma, and I think it's a film which naturally leads to argument and discussion. It's impossible to watch the film and not have a discussion. Well, do you think that it's an accurate portrayal of what happens when the balance of nature is upset?
Man in White Suit was made in 1951, so one of a handful of films made at Ealing between 1947 and 1957, which would become known as the Ealing comedies. And the reason for that was they broke the mould of British comedy at that time. If you look at the history of British sound comedy right up to the end of the war, it's dominated by star vehicles for established clowns. And it all changes dramatically at the end of the war. Only 3 major clowns continued to make films beyond 1946 into the 50s. Frank Randall, Arthur Askey and Arthur Lucan. And none of the new clowns that emerged after the war actually make an impact in British cinema until well into the 1950s. So a new kind of comedy was clearly being asked for. It was Ealing that came up with the formula.
Really, The Man in the White Suit is a film about the condition of Britain, made in the same year as the Festival of Britain, which was supposed to launch the bright new future after recovering from the war. And it's a film of real ambivalence. I mean, is Britain going to be stuck in the past, or is it going to embrace the future?
The film condemns the notion that you shouldn't take into account responsibility for your actions. Ealing films, the traditional Ealing films, the cosy whimsical films, which are basically the ones developed in the wake of the writer T.B. Clarke, often had a dreamer at their centre. But their dreams were realised with the help of the community and with their support. What happens in Man in the White Suit is you've got a dreamer who doesn't care, or doesn't seem to care, about what's going on.
The film suggests that science is going to bring a lot of problems, and those problems need to be solved in a much more sophisticated way than Britain, or at least the mill owners, are ready to do. It's a film of tremendous pessimism, I think, in the end, because it really suggests that science, left to its own devices, is really just disruption.
My dear King,
Alec Guinness was the main beneficiary of this change to literary comedies, great scripts where actors were asked to interpret the roles rather than having them built around him. And he does 6 comedies at Ealing, and despite all of his other extraordinary work, his association with those Ealing comedies tenaciously holds as his greatest achievement.
You see how intelligent he was. Guinness knew what film he was in. So he didn't cling to a sort of idea of himself. He was always a rather invisible figure, Guinness.
In many ways, the part that Guinness plays in The Man in the White Suit is simpler, much simpler than his other Ealing roles. They're more complex, and they involve more changes of disguise and makeup. Here he is, on the face of it, the knight in shining armour all the way through. He's the village idiot, the savant, who blindly pursues his goal. But at the same time, it's also shaded in some ways, and the sense in which we can read in him what his next move is going to be, the way he conveys his fantastic ability to kind of plot his way through this really stuffy old-fashioned society, is brilliantly executed.
Guinness gives a wonderfully sympathetic performance to a man who is actually not very nice. And it's his unthinkingness that makes him not very nice, and his absolute disregard of the effect of his work on others.
You're not even born yet. What do you think happened to all the other things? The razor blade that never gets blunt, and the car that runs on water with a pinch of something in it. No. They'll never let your stuff on the market in a million years.
He's right, Vested interests. The dead hand of monopoly.
It's not like that at all, I assure you. Everything's organised. We're telling the newspapers this morning and then going right ahead.
But if this stuff never wears out, We'll only have one lot to make.
At the end, the old lady says, well, how am I going to do some washing if the material never gets dirty? So it's a complex issue.
Mrs. Watson, have you got something? My suit. They can see me.
Why can't you scientists leave things alone? What about my bit of washing when there's no washing to do?
Most of the time we're with Sidney, we want him to succeed. But there are some important qualifications to that. There is the role of Daphne, played by Joan Greenwood. Daphne, who's clearly attracted to Sidney, and he represents something important for her. He sends her off to find out, what long molecules are.
It's really perfectly simple. I believe I've got the right catalyst to promote interaction between the reactive groups at the end of the peptide chains and the carbohydrate combination, while the charges of the ionic groups will cross-link the chains and confer valuable elastic properties. At high temperature and pressure, they're missing.
So that there's a great probability of polymerization.
She'd been in Kind Hearts and Coronets by then, so she was already sort of somehow separate from, I don't know, whoever the conventional Ealing heroine was. She was already more eccentric and more interesting. But that, I suspect, was because she was an interesting woman, so she could bring these sort of misfits to life.
Do you know what a long-chain molecule is? Do you know what happens if one makes one of infinite length with optimum interchain attractions? Do you know what it means? It means that to break the fiber, you'd have to split the molecule. It means for all practical purposes, it'd last forever. And it has a surface charge of static electricity. It repels dirt. That may be nonsense, of course. Maybe he hasn't really done it. Maybe he's talking through his hat. On the other hand, maybe he has. Maybe you're talking through yours. The point is you don't know, and you're too pig-headed to find out.
At the same time, she very cold-bloodedly takes on the role of going to seduce him out of his imprisonment.
There's a wonderful scene, isn't there, when they're suggesting that she seduce Alec Guinness, and she wants to know what her price is.
Since we're on the subject of price, what do I get out of it?
Miss Burnley.
Daphne.
I haven't had much experience with these sort of things, but I've always understood it was comparatively well paid.
Now, Miss Burnley, we didn't wish to offend you. I suggest 2,000.
Aren't you rating my value a little low? Wouldn't 5,000 be fairer?
5,000. Agreed.
Agreed. It's a pleasure to do business with you, Sir John.
Alexander McKendrick, the director of this, his previous film was Whiskey Galore, which was also incredibly well received, and this kind of consolidated his reputation, and universally great reviews.
The first 5 years of the 1950s, he was their talented one. He made all the good films. So he was everything that was interesting and complicated. I mean, I remember, because I was a child at the time, these films would come out. Whiskey Galore and The Maggie and finally The Lady Killers and The Man in the White Suit, and they were the really interesting films. They were more interesting than the films being made that were written by T.B. Clarke, for example. So everything that was sort of iconoclastic and disrespectful and irreverent and full of energy and vitality tended to be coming from Sandy.
I think Ealing was the perfect place for him to be. Because Ealing not only believed in the values of the Clement Attlee government, they actually worked that way as well. They collaborated on each other's films, they would comment each other, egos were kind of put to one side. Very paternalistic, but it actually worked very well because these were very, at the top echelons, were very creative people. And he learnt a lot from that process, and I think it, and he had something to work against, he had a context to work in, and he had a support system that allowed him to make some great films.
McKendrick never really feels like he's part of the sort of cosy side of Ealing. There's a side of Ealing in Passport to Pimlico, even the Lavender Hill Mob, which seems to be very sort of at ease with traditional London society. McKendrick never feels part of that. He's making films that are set outside of London. That's important. He, of course, eventually will leave Britain and spend the larger part of his life in America. And I think he always has that sort of outsider's view. He's very aware of what's wrong with Britain. in the post-war period, and he doesn't let us forget it.
Because it had many of the qualities that you associate with him. It was like a piece of clockwork. It was a beautiful mechanism. And it was saying things about Britain, where he lived. And indeed, in his complicated way, saying things about Ealing, where he worked.
Wait! All of you! Well, no, Sidney!
Stop him!
This is too much. No, listen. Wait, please. Wait, all of you.
Yes, Mr. Burnley?
Say, Sidney, no.
Beg your pardon, Mr. Burnley?
Now, look, Miss Johnson, there's a room for you.
Stop him!
He's ahead. Move there. Look here. You come. Wait. Half a minute.
Stop him! Stop him! Stop him!
Stop him.
I knew him for the last 3 years of his life. Firstly, he was an intellectual, which I hadn't realised. Secondly, he grew up on expressionist cinema, so he grew up seeing all those German films in the 20s. He was he was a draftsman, and he was a craftsman. He was just a very, very clever man. He understood. I remember him watching one of my films. The editor was just reminding me, and putting his finger, he said, "You'll want to move that scene and you can't. It'll drive you mad." He had a very, very good sense of structure. Anybody would be well advised to watch his work. You'd learn very good lessons from it.
Anyone could study the film today with great profit and see just how brilliantly constructed it is. Its sense of rhythm, its economy, its orchestration. The fact that it actually uses one of the oldest ideas in filmmaking, which is the chase, which has first one and then two and then a whole mob of people chasing the lone figure. This is a very, very old idea, but here we fall into it as if naturally, and the way that the different forces that are all converging on trying to find Sydney at the end is organised is quite brilliant. There's a lot that today's filmmakers could learn from it still.
It's like a film made in Toy Town, but then it was a film made in Toy Town, so, these characters you recognise, these butlers and people this use of character actors, that's what those films dealt with.
They're dealing with issues that still matter. I mean, one was watching the opening ceremony of the Olympics this year, Danny Boyle. I mean, it very much embraced the same ideals that the classic Ealing comedies, indeed most of the films in the 40s, embraced. So they are still very relevant. We still have this ongoing ideas about big society. What does that mean? What are our responsibilities to that? And so, yes, clearly relevant. And because the films are also intrinsically funny, they will last, I think, for a very, very long time.
Most extraordinary place, like a nursery, and like a sort of nanny state. I mean, nobody got rich or anything like that. It was the perfect studio for the welfare state.